Two experienced mountain bikers set out for what should have been an unforgettable ride at Lake Tahoe. They never came back. 7 agonizing years, their disappearance baffled investigators and tormented their families. When a hiker finally spotted something glinting on the edge of a 160-foot cliff, the truth came crashing down. But what really happened on that mountain trail? September 14, 2008. Marcus Chen, 32, adjusted his helmet while his younger brother David, 28, loaded gear into their truck. The brothers had been mountain biking together since they were teenagers, tackling some of Northern California's most challenging terrain. Marcus was methodical, a civil engineer who triple-checked everything. David was the adventurous one, a freelance photographer who chased thrills but never crossed into recklessness. Both had years of experience and deep respect for the mountains. Their mother, Susan, watched from the kitchen window. Something about that morning felt different, though she couldn't explain it. "Be careful up there," she called out. Marcus grinned. "Always our mom. We'll be back by sunset." David threw an arm around his brother. "And Marcus wants to beat his personal record. Can't decide who's crazier." They laughed together. Susan captured that moment without knowing it would become her most treasured memory. At 9:37 a.m., they stopped for gas 20 miles outside Tahoe. The clerk remembered them debating which trail to take. Marcus wanted the familiar Flume Trail. David pushed for the Eastern Ridge, less crowded, more challenging, virtually unused. "We'd have the whole mountain to ourselves," David argued over a trail map. Marcus calculated the risks. The Eastern Ridge trails were older, less maintained, definitely harder. But they'd handled difficult terrain before. "All right. But we stick together. No showing off." "Deal," David said, their signature handshake sealing it. By 11:15 they'd parked at the trailhead. The lot was empty except for a forest ranger's truck. The ranger gave them a rundown of trail conditions, warning about a narrow section 6 miles in where erosion had made things tricky. He wished them well. He was the last person to see them alive. Marcus photographed David at the trailhead, his brother grinning with Lake Tahoe glittering behind him like a massive sapphire. The timestamp read 11:23 a.m. They checked their gear one final time. Marcus texted his wife Jennifer, starting the ride. "Love you. See you tonight." Then they disappeared into the wilderness. The trail began with a gentle climb through pine forest. David rode ahead, stopping occasionally for photographs. Marcus followed at his steady pace. They developed an unspoken language over years of riding together. Around mile 4 they stopped at a panoramic viewpoint. Lake Tahoe stretched impossibly blue below them. "This never gets old," Marcus said. "This is why we do this," David agreed, framing shots with his camera. They sat for 10 minutes, breathing in the peace that only wild places provide. Then they continued on. The trail narrowed as they climbed higher. Exposed rock face on one side, steep drop-offs on the other. This was the section the ranger warned about. Erosion had eaten away at the trail's edge, leaving paths sometimes only 3 feet wide. "Stay left," Marcus called out. "Take it slow through here." "Got it," David replied. They were experienced enough to know this required focus and respect. One wrong move would have severe consequences. What happened next would remain a mystery for 7 long years. Jennifer Chen checked her phone again. 6:32 p.m. Marcus said they'd be back by sunset. They were cutting it close. By 7:15, as darkness settled, worry coiled in her stomach. She called Marcus's phone. Voicemail. David's phone. Same. Out of service area, she told herself. They got carried away exploring. By 8 o'clock, Jennifer called Susan. "Have you heard from the boys?" Jennifer kept her voice steady. Pause. "No. They should be back by now." The women tried to reassure each other. The brothers were experienced. They had gear. Maybe they decided to camp and watch stars. Maybe they lost track of time. But mothers know. Wives know. Something was wrong. By 9 o'clock, Jennifer called the El Dorado County Sheriff's Office. The deputy was kind but not concerned. 2 experienced men, well equipped, they probably underestimated the time. Give it until morning. Jennifer didn't sleep. She watched the driveway, willing headlights to appear. Susan sat across town looking at the sandwiches she'd packed, praying. When dawn broke with no word, Jennifer called again. This time, search and rescue was activated. The first team arrived at 10 a.m. to find the brothers' truck exactly where they'd left it. Everything locked up tight. No signs of disturbance. Search teams split up and headed into the trails, calling out names that echoed off rock faces. They looked for tire tracks, broken branches, scuff marks. They found nothing. As word spread, volunteers arrived. By the afternoon of the second day, over 100 people were combing the mountains. They worked in grid patterns. Teams rappelled down steep sections. A helicopter joined the search, flying low over the terrain. Still nothing. On day 3, search dogs were brought in. The dogs followed trails enthusiastically at first, then the scent would go cold. They'd circle back, confused. It was as if Marcus and David had evaporated. Jennifer and Susan made the trip to Tahoe to be near the search. They spent days at the command post, watching maps being marked, listening to radio traffic, drinking terrible coffee. Local news picked up the story. The brothers' faces appeared on television. Tips came in, possible sightings, suspicious vehicles. Each one led nowhere. By the end of week 1, the search covered 60 square miles. Infrared cameras were deployed. Technical rescue teams prepared to search cliff faces and narrow ravines. Still nothing. Not a single trace. 2 weeks in, a volunteer found a glove 8 miles from the trailhead, caught in brush 15 feet off the main trail. It matched what Marcus typically wore. The area was searched intensively. Nothing else appeared. Then came the disturbing report. A couple camping 5 miles from the trailhead came forward 3 weeks later. On the night of September 14th, around midnight, they'd been jolted awake by sounds. Screams. Distant but unmistakable. Human voices. The sounds lasted moments before fading. They'd huddled in their tent until dawn, then left. They hadn't reported it because they convinced themselves they'd imagined it. But guilt brought them forward. Could those have been Marcus and David? Search teams returned to that area with renewed intensity, calling out constantly. Silence was the only answer. As September turned to October, weather changed. Early storms brought rain and the first snow to peaks. If the brothers were still out there, exposure would be deadly. After 4 weeks, the official search was suspended. Not called off, suspended. The families were devastated. Jennifer returned to an empty house. Susan went home to photographs and rooms she couldn't change. The case remained open. Periodically, new tips would spark brief activity. But each lead evaporated. The first anniversary came with a vigil at the trailhead. Dozens gathered with candles, sharing memories, hoping for answers that refused to come. The mountain kept its secrets. The cruelty of disappearance is its ambiguity. Death provides awful finality, rituals, memorials, the gradual path of grief. But disappearance is different. It's grief without closure, mourning without permission, a wound that never heals because hope never quite dies. Jennifer learned this in the months that followed. Was she a widow? She wore her wedding ring, but her husband had no grave. Should people speak of Marcus in past tense? She took leave from work, unable to focus when her mind constantly wandered to those mountains. 3 months after, she finally entered the garage to look at Marcus's belongings. His tools. His other bike. His climbing gear. She touched the handlebars and something cracked inside her. She sank to the floor and wept, ugly, choking sobs from somewhere deep and primal. Susan became obsessed with keeping her son's memory alive. She created a website, learned social media, posted everywhere that might reach someone with information. She couldn't change their childhood bedrooms. She'd sit in those rooms trying to feel close to them. The divorced parents found strange unity in grief. Susan and Thomas met monthly for coffee, sharing theories, supporting each other through darkness. David's girlfriend Melissa struggled with her own unique grief. She had no official status, no recognized place in his disappearance. 6 months later, she made the agonizing decision to move forward, feeling guilty for living. The first year was hardest: birthdays, Thanksgiving, Christmas. Each holiday a fresh reminder. The second year brought different pain, realizing life continued without them. The world moved on. Even family seemed to accept they were probably dead. But accepting death without bodies felt impossible. The impact rippled through communities. Mountain bikers questioned their safety. Some stopped going to Tahoe altogether. Parents kept children closer to home. The Eastern Ridge Trail system saw usage drop dramatically. Some called it cursed. True crime media discovered the case in year 2. Podcasts theorized everything from tragic accident to foul play to staged disappearance. Online forums developed elaborate conspiracy theories. The family tried ignoring speculation but couldn't. Detective Sarah Morrison never stopped working it. She reviewed the file periodically, visited the trailhead repeatedly, followed every tip. Something about this case wouldn't let her go. The complete absence of evidence, the family's heartbreak, the mystery of how 2 experienced men simply vanished. 3 years after the disappearance, a false alarm briefly rekindled hope. A wrecked bike was found in a ravine. But it had been stolen before the brothers disappeared. Another dead end. 4 years. 5 years. 6 years. Each anniversary brought smaller gatherings at the trailhead. Sometimes just Susan and Jennifer, looking up at mountains that had swallowed their loved ones whole. 7 years after Marcus and David Chen vanished, most people had stopped looking. Only the family still believed answers might come. Those answers were waiting at the bottom of a cliff, hidden by nothing more than angle and shadow and the fact that sometimes the most obvious places are easiest to overlook. April 22, 2015. 7 years, 7 months, and 8 days after they disappeared. Claire Hernandez was a geology grad student who didn't stick to established trails. She spent weekends scrambling over rocks, reading Earth's history in layers of stone. That morning she decided to explore the Eastern Ridge area, the same trailhead where the brothers had started. 6 miles in, Claire left the main trail to investigate a cliff face showing interesting geological features. She carefully approached the edge when something caught her eye. A glint of metal. A tiny flash of reflected sunlight from far below. She stopped and looked more carefully. The cliff dropped 150 to 160 feet down to a boulder-strewn slope. That glint looked wedged between rocks as if it had fallen from great height. She zoomed in with her phone camera. The grainy image showed what looked like a twisted bicycle frame. Her heart raced. She knew about the missing bikers. Everyone in these mountains knew. Claire backed away carefully and found enough cell service to call 911. "I think I found something related to the missing bikers from 7 years ago. There's something at the bottom of a cliff. It looks like a bike." Within 2 hours, Detective Morrison arrived with a technical rescue team. By late afternoon, the team assembled at the cliff edge. "We need to rappel down," the coordinator said. "That's not easy access. Steep grade, loose rocks." Morrison nodded, mouth dry. After 7 years, could this finally be it? 2 experienced climbers began the careful descent as the sun painted the lake gold and crimson. The rappel took 30 minutes, navigating problematic sections where rocks threatened to cascade down. Finally, their voices crackled over the radio. "We're at the site. Confirming visual on 2 mountain bikes. Badly damaged. There are also human remains. 2 sets." Morrison closed her eyes. After 7 years of wondering, the answer had been here all along. "Can you confirm identity?" "We found a wallet. Driver's license visible. Marcus Chen." The scene was heartbreaking and confusing. The bikes were twisted, frames mangled, components scattered. Their position suggested they hadn't just rolled off, they'd fallen from significant height with force. The remains were partially skeletal, partially mummified by dry conditions and cold air. Separated by 15 feet, as if the brothers had fallen separately or been thrown apart by impact. Personal effects scattered among rocks, hydration pack fragments, torn backpack, bleached clothing. As the team documented everything, Morrison tried piecing together what happened. This cliff face was within the searched area but set back from the main trail, partially hidden by terrain angle. Unless you stood in exactly the right spot and looked down at the right angle, you'd never see the base. Recovery took 3 days. The technical nature of the site, the need to preserve evidence, and the condition of the remains required painstaking care. Each item was photographed, documented, and carefully lifted out. Susan Chen received the call on April 23. 7 years of not knowing, ended in a single devastating sentence: "We found them." The relief was immediate and crushing. Her sons were coming home. But they were coming home in body bags. Jennifer collapsed when she heard. 7 years of holding herself together, maintaining hope, refusing to fully grieve, it all came flooding out at once. The news spread quickly. Media returned with renewed interest. The story that had faded from headlines roared back. Missing Tahoe bikers found after 7 years, bodies discovered at base of cliff. Forensic analysis began immediately. The coroner confirmed both brothers died from massive trauma consistent with a fall from significant height. Multiple fractures, internal injuries. Death would have been relatively quick, possibly instantaneous. But questions emerged immediately. The investigation team stood at the cliff edge, trying to understand how the brothers ended up at the bottom. The trail at this point was narrow but navigable. About 4 feet wide with the cliff edge on one side. There were no tire marks near the edge. No skid marks. No gouges in the dirt suggesting someone braked hard or lost control. "It's like they just rode off," one investigator said. "But that doesn't make sense. These guys were experienced. They knew to be careful on narrow sections." Detective Morrison examined every inch of the area. The trail was in relatively good condition despite 7 years of weather. There should have been some evidence of what happened. A place where the path had given way, signs of the bike sliding, something. There was nothing. DNA analysis on the remains confirmed identity. Marcus and David Chen had been at the bottom of that cliff for 7 years. Examination of their injuries suggested they'd been on their bikes when they fell, positioned forward, arms extended as if gripping handlebars. Could they have been going too fast? Morrison asked the forensic team. Possible, but that section of trail doesn't invite speed. It's technical terrain. Experienced riders would slow down naturally. Wildlife. Could something have startled them? Maybe. A mountain lion or bear could have caused them to swerve. But there's no evidence of animal activity on the remains beyond normal scavenging after death. The medical examiner noted something else. Both brothers had broken bones that appeared to be fresh at time of death, consistent with the fall itself. But there were no defensive wounds, no signs of struggle, no evidence suggesting foul play before the fall. Morrison interviewed Claire Hernandez extensively. Had she seen anyone else in the area? Any signs of disturbance? Anything unusual at all? No. Just that glint of metal and her instinct to investigate. The detective returned to the case file, reviewing everything from 7 years ago. The torn glove found 8 miles away, was it even theirs? The screams reported by the camping couple. Could those have been the brothers? The timeline suggested they'd fallen during daylight hours, not midnight. So what had that couple heard? She stood at the cliff edge as the sun set, trying to imagine what happened. 2 brothers riding carefully on a narrow trail. What could have sent them both over the edge? Simultaneously? On their bikes? A brake failure? Mechanical issue? But 2 bikes experiencing catastrophic failure at the exact same spot? The odds were astronomical. A section of trail giving way? But the trail showed no signs of collapse even after 7 years. A moment of inattention? Both brothers at once? Marcus was methodical, always careful. David was adventurous but not reckless. The pieces didn't quite fit together. Morrison reviewed weather records from September 14, 2008. Clear skies. No rain that might have made the trail slippery. Moderate temperatures. Good visibility. Nothing that would create hazardous conditions. She examined the bikes more carefully. Both were high-quality mountain bikes, well-maintained before the fall. Brake lines were corroded after 7 years of exposure, but specialists determined they'd been functional before the crash. One detail haunted her. The position of the bikes and bodies suggested they'd gone over the edge at nearly the same time, landing close together. If one brother had fallen and the other tried to help, you'd expect different positioning, one at the edge trying to reach down, maybe. But both had clearly gone over while riding. The official report concluded, accidental death resulting from catastrophic fall while mountain biking on narrow trail section. Exact cause of fall unable to be determined due to lack of physical evidence and time elapsed. It was the best answer they could give. But it didn't feel complete. The memorial service was held on May 15, 2015, more than 7 years after Marcus and David had left for their ride. The church was packed. Family, friends, co-workers, fellow mountain bikers, people who'd never met the brothers but had followed their story. Susan Chen stood at the podium looking out at the sea of faces. She'd written a eulogy but found herself deviating from it. 7 years, she began, her voice steady despite tears streaming down her face. 7 years of not knowing. 7 years of hoping every time the phone rang. 7 years of seeing their faces in crowds, only to realize it was a stranger. She paused, composing herself. But today we can finally say goodbye. Today we can finally let them rest. Marcus and David lived fully. They chased adventure. They found joy in challenging themselves, in pushing boundaries, in experiencing the beauty of wild places. They died doing what they loved together as they did everything. Jennifer spoke next, sharing memories of Marcus. His terrible jokes, his methodical way of approaching problems, the quiet steadiness that had made her feel safe. I've learned that love doesn't end when someone disappears. It doesn't even end when you find out they're gone. Love just changes. It becomes memory. It becomes gratitude for the time you had. Friends shared stories. David's photography mentor talked about his talent, his eye for finding beauty in unexpected places. Marcus's colleague described his integrity, his kindness, his brilliant engineering mind. The caskets, closed given the condition of the remains, sat at the front of the church. After 7 years of being lost in the wilderness, the brothers were finally home. The burial was private, just family. Susan had chosen plots side by side. They did everything together, she explained. They should stay together. As earth covered the caskets, Susan felt something she hadn't felt in 7 years. Not peace exactly, but something like it. Closure perhaps. The terrible unknowing was over. The vigil had ended. She could finally grieve properly. In the weeks that followed, the family tried to process everything. Susan found herself going through old photos, no longer afraid to look at her sons' faces. Jennifer packed up Marcus's belongings not out of a need to forget, but as an act of honoring, donating his clothes to charity, giving his bikes to young riders who couldn't afford equipment, creating scholarships in his name. The mountain biking community held their own memorial ride, with dozens of riders making the trip to Tahoe. They didn't ride the Eastern Ridge Trail. No one wanted to. Instead, they chose the Flume Trail that Marcus had originally suggested. They rode in silence at first, then someone started sharing stories, and soon laughter mixed with tears as they remembered two men who'd loved these mountains. But questions lingered. In online forums, amateur investigators continued dissecting the case. What had really happened on that trail? The official conclusion of accidental fall satisfied some, but others remained convinced there was more to the story. Some theorized they'd been chased by a person or animal, and went over the edge fleeing. Others suggested medical emergency. Maybe one brother had a heart attack or seizure, causing both to lose control. A few still held to darker theories about foul play, though no evidence supported this. Detective Morrison filed her final report but kept copies of everything in her personal files. She'd done her job. She'd found them. She'd given the families closure. But part of her would always wonder about those final moments on the trail. What had Marcus and David seen in those last seconds? Had they known what was happening? Had they had time to be afraid, or had it been too fast for fear? A year after the discovery, Susan made a pilgrimage to the site. She'd needed time before she could face it. The place where her sons had died, where they'd lain undiscovered for 7 years while she searched desperately for them. Detective Morrison accompanied her, along with Jennifer and Thomas. They hiked the 6 miles in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The trail looked different than Susan had imagined. Beautiful, really. Peaceful. Not the dark, dangerous place her nightmares had constructed. They reached the spot where Claire Hernandez had stood. The cliff edge was marked now with a small plaque placed by the Forest Service. In memory of Marcus and David Chen, may the mountains you loved keep you safe. Susan stood at the edge looking down. From here you couldn't see the base. The angle was too steep, the vegetation too thick. She understood now why search teams had missed it. You'd have to be standing in this exact spot, looking at this exact angle, on a day when the sun hit just right to catch that metallic glint. 7 years, she whispered. You were here all along and we couldn't find you. You couldn't have known, Morrison said gently. We searched this area. We walked this trail. The topography just hid them. Susan nodded, though the guilt would never fully leave her. Somewhere in her heart, she felt she should have known. Should have sensed where they were. Mothers are supposed to know these things. Jennifer placed flowers at the edge. Marcus's favorite. Sunflowers, bright and optimistic and reaching toward the sun. Thomas stood silently, tears running down his weathered face, one hand on Susan's shoulder. They stayed for an hour, each saying their private goodbyes to the place where their loved ones had spent their last moments. As they prepared to hike back, Susan took one last look down into that steep ravine. What do you think happened? She asked Morrison. Really happened? The detective was quiet for a moment. Honestly, I think it was exactly what it appears to be. A tragic accident. Maybe they hit a patch of loose gravel. Maybe David's wheel caught on a rock and Marcus swerved to avoid him. Maybe a bird flew up suddenly and startled them. Sometimes there's no dramatic explanation. Sometimes terrible things happen for mundane reasons. But no evidence, Susan said. No skid marks, no signs of what caused it. 7 years of weather erases a lot, Morrison replied. Rain, snow, wind, sun. Whatever evidence was here got washed away long ago. It was a reasonable explanation. It probably was exactly what happened. But Susan noticed Morrison didn't quite meet her eyes when she said it. The detective had her own doubts, even if she'd never voiced them officially. As they hiked back down the mountain, Susan thought about legacy. How do you memorialize a life that ended unexpectedly? How do you find meaning in senseless tragedy? She'd started a foundation in her son's names, providing equipment and training to young people interested in outdoor recreation, emphasizing safety without discouraging adventure. Marcus would have approved of the systematic approach. David would have loved inspiring the next generation of adventurers. The case officially closed. The brothers were at rest. The family had their answers, or as close to answers as they'd ever get. Life continued as it always does, carrying those left behind forward into futures that the lost would never see. But sometimes, on clear autumn days when the light hits the mountains just right, Susan thinks about that narrow trail and two brothers who loved adventure. She thinks about the fine line between safety and risk, between caution and courage. She thinks about how quickly everything can change. One moment you're riding through paradise and the next you're gone. The Eastern Ridge Trail is still there. Hikers and bikers still use it, though fewer than before. The Forest Service has improved some sections, widened the narrow parts, added warning signs. The cliff where Marcus and David fell has additional barriers now, making it harder to get too close to the edge. But the mountain itself remains unchanged, beautiful and deadly, inviting and unforgiving. It keeps its secrets. And perhaps in those final moments before impact, it offered the brothers something. One last perfect view of the lake they loved, one last rush of adrenaline, one last moment of being alive and together in the wild places they'd always sought. The truth is, no one will ever know exactly what happened on that trail. The mountains saw it, but mountains don't speak. They simply endure, watching as humans come and go, testing themselves against rock and height and distance, sometimes winning, sometimes losing. Marcus and David Chen came to the mountains seeking beauty and adventure. They found both. And they never left. What really happened that day? Was it truly an accident? A simple tragedy with no villain, no mystery, just bad luck and physics? Or is the mountain still holding back its final secret? Was there something more that happened on that narrow trail, something that will never be known? The official answer is clear: accidental death. But in the spaces between the facts, in the silence of unanswered questions, mystery still lingers. And perhaps that's how it should be. Perhaps some stories aren't meant to have neat endings. Perhaps some questions are meant to remain open, reminding us that we don't control everything, that nature is more powerful than our plans, and that every adventure carries risk. 7 years of silence ended with discovery. 7 years of questions ended with answers. But the most important question, the one that haunts anyone who loves wild places, remains: how do we honor the beauty of the wilderness while respecting its dangers? How do we live fully without living recklessly? Marcus and David didn't have the answer. None of us do. We simply make our choices and hope that when we set out into the mountains, we'll return home safely. Most of the time we do. But sometimes the mountain asks for more than we intended to give. And we become part of its eternal landscape, our stories absorbed into its ancient stone, our memories carried on the wind that blows through pine trees and across blue water that reflects endless sky. The Chen brothers are home now. At rest. At peace. Their adventure finally, tragically, complete.